Hello, Sarah.
Hi, Jenna.
How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited for spring and soaking up the sun and the warmer weather. Excited to not have to wear two pairs of pants every day.
The sunlight, the daylight. Very nice.
Yeah, the daylight. Things are changing. I'm feeling good despite the challenging year that we're having.
Yes. So as I've said, I couldn't think of anyone else to be talking about this topic. You've been part of my journey with sustainability from the very start, and you are one of the only reasons why I became passionate about it and know about it, and I am forever thankful for that. But if you wouldn't mind, if you could just give yourself kind of an intro and just explain who you are and what you do, that would be great.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Jenna. I'm Sarah Berquist, and I am an instructor, advisor, and program coordinator for sustainable food and farming at UMass Amherst, and teach several different courses relevant to food, food systems, food justice, education, agricultural education, and also have the pleasure to work with a lot of students in a one-on-one context, advising, and doing curriculum management as a program coordinator. So I have a pretty sweet job. I get to work with students who want to change the world and make the food system a better and more just place. So I feel like a lot of the time, like I lucked out. I feel really fortunate to have so many angles to get to work with. I'm biased, but I think the best students. So
And we're just as lucky to have someone as passionate as you, and you change lives as much as you help other people change lives. So it's we're very fortunate. Obviously, sustainability is a really broad and big topic, and it's equally as important. But if you could share maybe three facts, 3 points, 3 things, if you want to call them, about sustainability that you feel like everyone should know,
mm,
whether those be super vague or simple or more in depth. Just 3 things that you would.
sure. Um, well, I guess the things that come to mind most for me when I think about sustainability is, eh, the way I frame it when I describe our major, sustainable food and farming. So our major has sustainability in its title, which means, all of our programming um, is in some way connected to sustainability. So when I explain it to prospective students and do strategic planning and evaluation of our curriculum, I think of the 3 E's or the 3 P's: the people, planet, profit concept, or I think in an expanded version, social equity, environmental integrity, and economic vitality. And I think those 3 pieces, it used to be that I would have to explain sustainability for like the incoming class,
Mhm.
but now it's just, and I haven't been in it forever, right? Like I've been in it though for say 6 7 years ago I was giving way more of an in-depth introduction to sustainability, whereas now 6 or 7 years later the incoming batch of students already know, they like have working definitions of sustainability. So just in that last very short time, this incoming generation of students already understand that this is like relevant, important, and what it is more
Mhm.
or less. But that said, what is some in some ways catching up, but is still often not as emphasized as the social equity dimension of sustainability. And for something to be truly sustainable, it also has to be equitable. And I think anchoring into this moment where equity, diversity, and inclusion are more at the forefront of in the workplace and just how we navigate social systems in our world today, sustainability is a way to look at social equity and balance with other dimensions like economics and the environment. So, sometimes people ask me like, is sustainability just a buzzword? And I think that there are certainly aspects of it that would give it that it has characteristics of what a buzzword would have, but I still argue that it has substance in a way, because I think that, um, there's those three P's, but so often social equity isn't considered. And we consider like, um, with clothing companies, for example, if they're promoting something to be sustainable, or in produce, if something's sustainable, we don't really have many metrics to evaluate social equity. So with environmental integrity, we can look at carbon footprint,
Mhm.
right? With economic vitality, you can look at profit and net gain for a business, net income. Social equity is a little bit, like right now we're looking at minimum wage,
Mhm.
and that's like one capacity for someone to have capital, which is a dimension of equity. But really, like, social equity is a little bit more complex, harder to measure, and therefore um, not always represented when we call something sustainable.
Yeah.
So I guess that's kind of the those are the main things that come to my mind when I think about sustainability. And I also think about inequity and how much work there is to do, not only to grow food in more environmentally friendly ways, like in the organic movement.
Mhm.
It's looking at the impact of chemicals and land use and care for soil health. Those things are all super important. And for a truly sustainable agriculture, we really need to look at the human part of that too, the labor force, right? You can have an amazing organic farm that has abysmal working conditions. Is that sustainable?
Yeah.
So for me, sustainability is really looking at all those dimensions, and, having the skills to evaluate, like, it's not which one is most important, but it's a matter of like, how do we measure social equity?
Yeah.
And I think that's a question that we're asking in our food system, but we're also just asking more broadly as a society right now. In the face of so much blatant inequity, I think that it's more important than ever, you know?
Yeah, and that's a main reason why I'm even doing this is because there are these big topics and these things that people maybe do think are buzzwords or are trendy words, and there's so many layers to them, and those components of sustainability that you don't, like you said, you don't want to argue what's most important when you look at sustainability, but those layered topics that are at the forefront of what sustainability actually is, but aren't maybe as talked about or as represented, and I think that's really important. And it leads really well into kind of what I wanted to bring up next about obviously with so many food topics and so many important food topics, there's a lot of misconception and there's a lot of overflow of information on, what's organic and what is sustainable. And there's clearly misconceptions and too much information. So if you could, obviously this is a very in-depth question that could be hard to answer, but if there's one or two misconceptions that you would maybe like to clear or just kind of talk about a little bit more,
Mm.
that's such a huge part of this is really getting information out to people that's worthwhile and starts a discussion, but also makes them a little bit more aware.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that we could expand on here. Um, but I think one thing, I don't know if I'd call it a misconception, but it's like one thing I learned recently of like, from Leah Penniman's from Soulfire Farm, who's just doing amazing work to amplify um, the role social equity plays in actually advancing just food systems, and her work training youth of color and empowering youth of color and growing food and doing amazing work with people of color on her farm. I think, land ownership is something that feels really important to talk more explicitly about, and how hard it is to gain access to land just as a human being. And I think we're seeing this now, particularly in the pandemic, with housing being really hard to secure, this demand for housing. And land, similarly, it's like really hard to get land.
Yeah.
And so, disproportionately so if you're a person of color, and particularly like looking at how different struggles. I think that it was 1612, a series done by the New York Times somewhat recently, that profiles the challenges of of Black farmers in
Mhm.
particular, that the hurdles that they have a lot of forces working against them to be able to farm. And that's like pay like interest on loans, not getting the funds released at in a timely way, not getting access to resources that other white growers get. So I just want to, I think that that disparity isn't talked about enough.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, the local food movement is phenomenal, and it's addressing the need for more farmers. We need more farmers,
Mhm.
and we need all people to be able to access land the same way. And we need to reconcile a history that's one of a lot of violence and also just exclusion and elitism, where white people get land.
Yeah.
And so and that's, you know, maybe I have access to land because I have an inheritance, right? And maybe that inheritance is because I'm on land that was essentially a gain from land theft,
Yeah.
right? So um it's just looking at, I think, all those things of like the very root of it. Like, okay, yes, I think there's so many dimensions of food systems change and production, and having more farmers is a really big part of it, right? The way that we grow our food is so industrialized in this country. And if we want to have more systems for stronger local economies and stronger local farms, um, all people need to access land, and we need to prioritize how can we get land back to indigenous communities, tribal communities, and also how can we expand um, access and remove and, you know, bust these barriers that we've got that are generations old, giving fair access and prioritizing access for Black farmers in particular. So that's something that I've learned a lot and looked at. And there's more. And I'm, you know, like, I'm not the one to tell that story. I think Leah and her team of educators and activists do really well. And I recommend to anybody looking at the resources that Soulfire Farm has put out, particularly in the last year or two. It's incredible what they're doing. So I just want to uplift their work, because it's been really helpful, I think, in shining lights on places where the local food movement is missing that part of the story, right?
Yeah.
So for me, that's one thing or two things or three things, right? That I think that there's more to learn there. And I think particularly like getting to know neighbor farmers and getting involved. Like, there's so many ways that people can get involved that are beyond growing and consuming. So
Mhm.
many community organizations, particularly this year, COVID has shined a light on how many people are still food insecure, and that how the populations of food insecurity is growing. And I think one of the misconceptions is that it is not addressing the entanglement of poverty with food insecurity. Like, we really need to look at how, you know, poverty is embedded. Like, if we're going to make food systems change, we also need to make change in economically, socioeconomic changes that uplift and enable people to make enough money to buy good food. And I think we know, you know, like, I'm not the first one to talk about this. There's
Yeah.
so many great scholars and activists doing this work in community groups and in all at all levels. But I think unless we make large policy changes that promote more equitable share of money for people, I think the myth of food insecurity and hunger are poor. Like, you know, people are food insecure. We have neighbors and friends that are food insecure that we don't know them, and we don't know their stories. And I think that there's a lot of shame around that story that is not that myth needs to be busted, right? So that's just something I think about a lot when I think about, like, um, you know, the work that we have to do in food systems to I don't want to say normalize or destigmatize but we have like food pantries and charities and faith-based organizations that serve food are a huge part of a solution, right? But they that's a band-aid, an acute fix to feed hungry people now. How
Mhm.
are we going to change the system down the road so that we just have less people needing to rely on those
Yeah.
things? So I think I'm maybe even going beyond what you've asked me, Jenna, but those are things I think of when I'm like, this is what I want, this is what I care about in our food system, right?
And I think it's so important when looking at any topic, but especially a topic like sustainability, how great it is, sure, that organic food is popularized again and local food is popular and knowing your farmer, I hear that phrase a lot, and knowing your food and all of that. But we forget often how deep these topics truly are, and how with anything, there's always going to be a question of equality and justice for everyone. And as you said, you've made some great points about really like the core of farming and who really truly brought farming to this country, and kind of the history of that and the hard things that need to be talked about and need to have light shed on them, because that's truly what sustainability came from at its core. And I think you make so many great points about how, there are misconceptions about what it takes to be a farmer and who really is the farmers, the local farmers that are making up a lot of the local food we're eating. Sure, it's great that we have organic farms, but when looking at who's getting access to that land and who's able to become a farmer, when you look at the core of who has the access to become a farmer, and Soul
Mhm.
Fire Farm is such an amazing example of that. And just everything they're bringing to light is so important. But it's going to take those deep policy changes and structural changes, with so many things, with systemic racism and
Right.
equality and justice, to make sure that everyone can be a farmer. Because
Yeah.
if you're truly supporting the organic food movement and sustainability, you'll support anyone and everyone becoming a farmer, and farm workers' rights and labor rights. And I'm really glad you brought that up as a misconception, because it's the core of sustainability and it's necessary for everyone to know about.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I'm glad you said when you said farm worker, that's something I also just want to emphasize too, is like, we can have campaigns like know your farmer, right? And then you can see a beautiful picture of, a white couple and their amazing farm.
mhm,
And that's beautiful. And that's an important story to tell. And often what goes untold, many of these medium scale diversified vegetable farms have farm workers that are least protected,
yep,
working the hardest,
yep,
most vulnerable. And their stories don't get, they're farmers,
yep,
and they're the story of like, farmer of the week, local hero. They're the local heroes too, and even more so, right? So just that disparity and that injustice, that the inequity still present in the difference of farmers, farm owners, land owners, and farm workers. And there's a lot left of work. There's a lot more work to do, to advance the rights of farm workers, and expand, access to viable livelihoods through leadership roles, um, and in transitioning land ownership, and expanding land ownership, to farm workers, and like I was saying earlier, I just wanted to make that distinction too
yeah,
about farmers and farm workers, and how that's just so, that it's strong, and that's apparent in particularly like small, medium scale, large, diversified organic veg farms.
yeah. And I think so much of what you've said kind of has taken such an important angle on discussing sustainability. And I think, as I've mentioned before, we tend to focus so much on what is sustainable and how can you call something sustainable and what is organic and this and that. And there's so much misconception around that. But when you sit and you look at truly, the core of what sustainability is, and who our farmers are, and all of that, that's when you learn the most about it, because that's when you tell your mind and yourself, to do research and to research these lesser known topics about sustainability. Because I found that with myself, that's when I became more in tune about what my sustainable lifestyle, and how I was sustainable in my lifestyle came from, discovering these harder to talk about topics, and truly what's at the core of being sustainable. So I thank you a lot for shedding light on that, and
Yeah.
stressing what's important to you about sustainability and about being an educator, and a mentor to so many people. And like I said once before, you truly are changing lives with how you discuss sustainability, and what you did to my life. Just, shining my light on how we should be seeing our food was so important to me. And I'm so thankful for that. And I'm
Well,
so,
I'm thankful for you including me, and to see you out there in exploring this at the graduate level, and see you asking these questions and reaching out and trying to, just share this information. I think it's really critical, and you're in the movement, Jenna. You're making it happen too.